I'm Kamal Santamaria. This is Counting the Cost on Al Jazeera, with a special look this week at the financial cost of the 9/11 decade. It was a decade marked by wars, expensive wars, the kind which have led to a time of record debt in the United States. And stubbornly high unemployment. We ask if years of war abroad have come at the expense of jobs at home, as Barack Obama tries to reverse the slide. So welcome everyone to part of Al Jazeera's in-depth look at the 9/11 decade, this time though with a financial slant. Of course, we all remember the sharp shock to the markets after the attacks when Wall Street was actually closed, but it's the economic picture in the 10 years following which has really changed as a result. Just consider for a moment what has happened in this period that we're calling the 9/11 decade. The pain it has wrought on the United States, the sole superpower, recession, housing and debt crises, millions of people unemployed, and of course, the cost of war. That's where we're going to start, actually. October 7, 2001, when the United States launched Operation Enduring Freedom in Afghanistan. Since then, Washington has spent almost $460 billion on the war there. Then the controversial decision to invade Iraq, a cost there of close to $800 billion. All up, the total amount appropriated by Congress for these wars is up at $1.26 trillion, or if you adjust for inflation, about $1.3 trillion. But the way Washington sets aside its budgets confuses the exact amount spent on the wars, because some of this money is apportioned to other budgets. In fact, Brown University in Providence, Rhode Island estimates the US has actually spent $3.7 trillion, or more than $12,000 per American citizen. The thing is, ending these wars wouldn't necessarily mean an end to the cost of them. In fact, economist Joseph Stiglitz and Professor Linda Bilmes, who we'll be speaking to later, say that 50% of returning troops need ongoing medical help with disability payments. They're up at about $900 billion now. Before 9/11, US defence spending was about $300 billion for 2011, though it is right up, look at it, at over $700 billion, more than the defence spend of the entire world put together. In theory, this all should have made a lot of work, though. You pour money into the industrial defence complex, it creates jobs, it stimulates the economy, right? Not necessarily. Over the last 10 years, the money the government receives has barely changed and currently stands at $2.17 trillion. But the money being spent, that's more than double to $3.82 trillion, which means you've got a budget deficit of about $1.65 trillion. In short, the US government is spending more money than it is taking in taxes. Now, in previous wars, it turned to the public to raise money through extra tax. Not this time, though. This time it's borrowing money, which goes a long way to explaining this number, the headline, the awful headline number, in fact, of $14.2 trillion worth of debt in the United States, something that will continue to rise. In fact, the economist Joseph Stiglitz, who we mentioned earlier, said this on the topic. We've got a quote to show you. He said the wars contributed to the United States' macroeconomic weakness, which exacerbated its deficit and debt burden. Then as now, and this is key, disruption in the Middle East led to the higher oil prices and leading Americans to spend more money on oil imports that they otherwise could have spent buying goods produced in the US. But the Federal Reserve hid these weaknesses by engineering a housing bubble that led to a consumption boom. So you see the knock-on effect over the years there. So here's where we want to start to make the correlation. Did going to war and the financial overreach that produced cost the American economy dearly, especially when we consider that, yes, the Afghanistan war was understandable at the time, but the invasion of Iraq 17 months later was perhaps not so. So was it all worth it? We'll look more at the numbers in a moment. First, some personal stories in this report from Mike Hanna in Washington, D.C.
Amidst the monuments to fellow soldiers who died in previous wars, an Iraq veteran remembers when his began. Jeff Millard's National Guard unit was the first deployed into the rubble of the World Trade Center on the day the towers fell and determined his future.
9/11 became the reason why we did everything. So if there was a ruck march, we were rucking because of 9/11. If we were doing a parade, that parade was because of 9/11.
And Jeff Millard went to war in Iraq because of 9/11. Because that is where his leaders had said the enemy was.
There is no doubt that Saddam Hussein now has weapons of mass destruction.
The British government has learned that Saddam Hussein recently sought significant quantities of uranium from Africa.
But a few months before, Ambassador Joe Wilson had investigated this claim at the request of the CIA and determined it was false. information at odds with that being used by the Bush administration.
A senior official at the State Department told me flatly, if you want this to be corrected, you're probably going to have to write the story yourself. So I sat down and did.
The article in the New York Times received a ferocious response from the Bush administration, not just against Joe Wilson. The information was leaked to the media that his wife, Valerie, was in fact a CIA agent, a leak that ended her career.
I'm sorry, I can't give you any comment.
I believe that they were sending a message to the intelligence community that if you do to us what Joe Wilson just did to us, we will do to you what we just did to his family. Be afraid, be very, very afraid.
And a decade later, a measure of the cost. To Joe Wilson, an erosion of faith.
So I think that the myth of the United States of America globally has been that we were a nation of laws and a nation that had a sense of what was morally acceptable. It would support human rights, who would support individual rights, support freedom of the press. Now I believe it's harder to make that case.
For Jeff Millard, a cost measured in Iraqi and US lives.
Well, let me say first that the biggest cost for me when it comes to connecting 9/11 to Iraq is how many of my friends died in Iraq. It's how many of my friends have permanent disabilities like I have from Iraq.
And he says the administration linked 9/11 to Iraq because it could.
We lost 2,000 people in a matter of a couple hours. That's too much of a connection. And then the constant media coverage of something like that just seared it into us. Every American out there, and most people worldwide, have a gut reaction to 9/11. So it's the perfect selling point.
And looming amidst the ghosts of soldiers past, a somber thought on this anniversary, that in the tragedy of 9/11, there were those who also saw opportunity.
But did they see the cost? Did they know how much money this Iraq war would require? Someone who's gone some way to figuring that out is Professor Linda Bilmes from the Harvard Kennedy School, a leading expert in US public finance with numerous senior positions in government to her name. Professor, thank you for your time. You wrote a book called The $3 Trillion War. I wonder if that number even surprised you when you came to those conclusions about the cost of Iraq.
Well, it did surprise us when we first counted it up, but of course the number has risen even higher since we wrote the book in 2008. And really the book right now should be called the $4 to $6 trillion war.
So what in the end were your conclusions about what went wrong? I suspect that there's a multitude of reasons, but in short, was it short-sightedness? Was it the United States rushing to war and not planning for all eventualities?
Well, there were many things that went wrong. If you go back to the time when the decision to invade Iraq was being taken in late 2002 and early 2003, there were many voices who looked at the situation at the time and predicted that this could be a very long, expensive conflict with a very long occupation if things did not go well. And even the president's own economic advisor, Lawrence Lindsay, felt that the war could cost between 1 to 2% of GDP. But he was actually fired for expressing that viewpoint. And those who had prevailed at the time, including Secretary Rumsfeld and Vice President Cheney, expected that we would have a very short, very quick, very cheap war that would cost $50 or $60 billion. And clearly they were wrong in retrospect, but there were already signs very early on that the war could become protracted, but those voices were simply ignored.
And do you think they were factoring in the post-war properly? Things like looking after the veterans once they've come home and their health care and their rehabilitation, or something like post-traumatic stress disorder, all these sorts of things which came out. From your research, do you think anyone was actually thinking about these issues pre-war?
Well, they certainly were not factored in. There were many things that were not factored in. Throughout history, I think that those who are most eager to go to war tend to underestimate the costs of war. And one thing that we do know from studying many previous wars is that war costs go on for a very long period of time after the war has finished. But in particular, in the Iraq and Afghanistan conflicts, there have been high casualty rates. There's been a high survival rate, which is the good news, but that means that there is going to be a very, very long tail of costs in terms of providing medical care and disability benefits for the military veterans. In addition to that, there is the cost of replacing, replenishing all of the military equipment that has been used up at 6 to 10 times the peacetime rate. And there is what is perhaps the most aberrant feature of this war, which is that it has been paid for entirely on the credit card. And the cost of borrowing and repaying the money with interest adds a major cost in terms of the budget to the war. In addition, you have the economic and the social costs of the war. The economic costs have been immense. Not only the fact that we have actually added at least $2 trillion to the national debt as of now, but the fact that we still owe trillions of dollars in the future, which will have to be paid. And then finally, there's the fact that the war itself contributed to many of the economic problems that we now face in the country. The war was one of the factors that led to higher oil prices. The higher oil prices were one of the factors that led the Federal Reserve to increase liquidity so much into the U.S. economy. The increased liquidity was one of the factors that led to the housing bubble. The housing bubble, of course, bursting and so on, contributed to the financial crisis. So all of these things are interrelated. And now we're in a situation where we've had the severe financial crisis, we have the enormous debt, much of which was caused by the war, and we're having to dig out from here.
Yeah, and perhaps unemployment, we might add that to the list as well. In fact, we'll talk more about that in a moment. I do want to go back to that analogy you had about this being a credit card war, paid for on credit. In short, why was that? Was it just that, this was a war the administration of the time just couldn't go to the public with? It couldn't raise taxes to pay for the war, as previous wars were financed through taxes?
Well, this really was an aberration in terms of U.S. history. All previous U.S. wars have been paid for through higher taxes, and even Ronald Reagan, who was no fan of bigger government, raised taxes 3 times to pay for the Cold War. So if you want to reach back to try and find a precedent in U.S. history, you have to go as far back as the Revolutionary War, when we borrowed from France, when the colonies borrowed from France to pay for the war against the UK. But even that is not an exact analogy, because far from raising revenues, we actually cut taxes in 2001 and again in 2003 as we embarked on the Second War. So this combination of lower revenues through these 2 enormous tax cuts at the same time that we went to war have left the United States in a very major financial hole and debt.
Linda, stay with me one moment, if you will, because we sort of started to make a correlation earlier between the cost of wars and current unemployment levels, and I just want to remind our viewers of that situation as it stands right now. There are an estimated 14 million people unemployed in the United States, more than 6 million of which have been without a job for more than 6 months. All that equates to a stubbornly high unemployment rate of around 9% it is at the moment. So the question is, what can President Obama and his administration do about that? We're going to get more from Linda Bilmes again in just a moment, and how it ties in with overspending elsewhere. First, though, a quick report from Patty Culhane on the jobs plan.
The president was pretty clear on why he was here.
You should pass this jobs plan right away. Pass it right away. You should pass it right away. Pass this bill.
His jobs bill, another stimulus plan, almost exactly like the one he got passed when he was first elected. Billions for building projects, money for states to pay workers, and tax breaks.
It will create more jobs for construction workers, more jobs for teachers, more jobs for veterans, and more jobs for long-term unemployed. It will provide a tax break for companies who hire new workers, and it will cut payroll taxes in half for every working American and every small business.
14 million Americans can't find work. Almost 9 million can't find enough work. Liberal economist Pat Garofalo says the president's plan, if passed, might help a little.
It's not a package of the size that will get the 14 million jobs back that we've lost, but you can at least maybe get the trend going in the right direction.
Now, the president's plan would cost the federal government about $450 billion. Here's the catch. Republicans say they won't pass anything that adds on to the national debt. The president says he's going to make cuts so that it won't add onto the debt, but he's not going to unveil those plans until next week. Some indications are his ideas are ones that have already been rejected by not just the Republicans, but members of his own party.
Pass it right now, take what I give you, is not a compromise.
I don't think he's proposing a bill that he expects to be able to pass.
Even the president posed the question, can the politicians finally agree when past disagreements have caused Americans so much concern?
We can stop the political circus and actually do something to help the economy.
Polite applause, but that's not exactly a definitive answer.
Professor Linda Boom is still with us from the Harvard Kennedy School. Historically, you could say war has stimulated economies. Almost an argument at the time that a war could have helped with job creation. Could it have done that if it was all done properly?
Well, first of all, I want to correct what you have just said. Wars have not typically been good for economies. And because of the fact that World War II was essentially an enormous stimulus to the U.S. economy, and which was one of the factors. I mean, the stimulus was one of the factors that got us out of the Depression. I mean, there is this sort of misinformation that wars in general are good for economies. In this case you had was a war that has been very negative for the economy, as many wars have been, partly because of the fact that all of the money that we used to wage the war has been borrowed, and much of the spending in the war has been spending which has been paid to contractors overseas that have a very low stimulative effect on the U.S. economy. But whenever you talk about spending money, the question is compared to what? What is the counterfactual? So if we're talking about the $2 trillion that has already been spent on the wars in Iraq and Afghanistan and the related defense spending, what else could we have done with that money? And compared to almost any other type of spending that we could have undertaken, whether it would be for infrastructure or for education or simply digging holes and filling them up in the U.S., that would have been better for the economy and better for jobs.
Yeah, I think you've actually almost preempted what I was going to ask you next, Linda, because I was recalling what Barack Obama said back in, it was probably January or February this year when he spoke about China, and he said, you know, quite openly, they've got the better infrastructure, they've got the better roads and the rail and the internet, and they're creating work now to safeguard the future. With all this war money we've talked about, the US could have actually kept pace with China, probably.
Well, I think when you look at something like infrastructure spending, you get much more bang for the buck, because first of all, you're employing all of those who are involved in actually building the infrastructure, but then the infrastructure itself leads to more investment and better productivity and to more jobs. So it's a kind of a twofer. But you don't have to go very far. You can drive 5 minutes from where I am at Harvard University and see all of the potholes in the roads and the bridges and tunnels and the infrastructure in the United States that needs badly attention. And I think that the fact that we have over the last 10 years squandered trillions of dollars in overseas wars that have not been good for the economy is one of the kind of hidden costs of this war. So it's not, it's in the same way that infrastructure spending and education spending gives you more bang for the buck, this gave us less, because we not only spent it on things that didn't benefit the economy, but now we're left with the deep hole that we've dug ourselves into.
Linda, it is an unfortunately grim topic, but it has been great talking to you about it. Thank you, Professor Bilmes there in Harvard. Now we are looking at some other business news this week on Counting the Cost. We're back in Libya a little later on, looking at a discovery which might implicate China in an arms deal during Gaddafi's last months in power. The Swiss National Bank pretty much stunned the markets by setting a ceiling for the Swiss franc against the euro. The problem for the Swiss is that the franc has been seen as a safe haven. People have been buying it up, and as such have been driving up its value and then making Swiss industry uncompetitive. We'll talk more about that with Manoj Ladwa now. He's a senior trader at ETX Capital in London. Manoj, thank you for your time. What was interesting, I thought, was the language used by the Swiss National Bank. I'm quoting here as well, aiming for a substantial and sustained weakening of the Swiss franc. We are prepared to buy foreign currency in unlimited quantities. That's very, very strong and clear language over this issue.
Absolutely, it was very aggressive language, and what we've seen with the Swiss franc, as you well mentioned, is that it had become a safe haven asset. Apart from gold, there's very few places for investors to place their money, and that has sent the Swiss franc rocketing higher month after month. And given the GDP numbers that came out of Switzerland last week, which were in line with expectation, but certainly the export side of the GDP figures was suffering massively, the Swiss National Bank had very few options but to intervene and buy up other foreign currencies, sell their own currency and prop up the markets. And they've set a floor of around about €1.20 for the Swiss franc, and we saw it very quickly move up 10 big figures within a short period of time. And that's where it is at the moment, and this could define a turn in trend for the Swiss franc. So we could have seen the end of this bullish run that it's been going through.
The Chinese yuan or renminbi is always interesting when you're talking currency, and there have been a few movements in the last week. Just want to mention these for our viewers. A report that it could be fully free floating by 2015. There was Nigeria increasing its yuan reserves as well. Then China sort of gave the nod to London and said, yes, this could be a hub for yuan trading. So much movement in what could be a very, well, already is, but could end up being a very, very powerful currency in the world.
Absolutely. It's a currency that's very tightly controlled by the Chinese authorities, but they recognise their place in the global arena. They're number 2 in the world, and other countries, other investors want to get involved in the yuan and start buying up the currency, and with it being a limited currency, it's very difficult to do that. And they're potentially looking for London to become the main financial centre for yuan trading, which would be fantastic for the UK. And as you mentioned, there's other countries already expressing an interest in shifting out of gold and out of the dollar and into the yuan. Nigeria has already mentioned that they want to hold at least 10% of their reserves in the yuan, and I wouldn't be surprised to see other African nations follow suit as well. China has been making big moves into Africa, and it's likewise that we see a move from Africa into China as well.
Manoj Ladwa talking currency with us this week on Counting the Cost. Thanks for that. Finally to Libya and an apparent arms trade which is emerging there, and it seems to involve the Chinese. Uncovered documents have shown Chinese arms companies offered to sell weapons to Muammar Gaddafi during the final months of his regime, though Beijing says it knows nothing about it. What's concerning is that if true, it would not only show cooperation with the regime, but would have violated a UN arms embargo. More from James Bays.
For more than 6 months, the battles raged across Libya. Day after day, Gaddafi's tanks and heavy weapons were targeted from the air by NATO. The Libyan leader urgently needed new stocks of artillery, heavy guns and missiles, and he turned to China to get them.
This document reveals that at the end of July, military officers travelled from here in Tripoli all the way to Beijing to negotiate a series of arms sales totalling more than $200 million. This document reads like a military catalogue. There are pistols, small arms, heavy guns, night vision equipment, even surface-to-air missiles.
We showed the documents to the finance minister of the National Transitional Council. Will it affect some of the future contracts that you might award? And you might decide, for example, not to award contracts to Chinese companies?
I think the answer is yes. No question about it. If indeed, and again, if indeed the Chinese government agreed to sell arms to Gaddafi only a month ago, I think definitely that will affect our relationship with China, and it will not necessarily be a favorable thing to this relationship.
Contracts to rebuild Libya's damaged infrastructure and to further develop its energy resources are likely to be worth billions. The NTC say it's not just China that may lose out. The documents suggest that Libya's neighbour Algeria and South Africa may have helped in the transport of weapons to Gaddafi's forces.
And that is where we'll leave you this week. But if you want to get in touch with the show, here's how you do it. Hop on Twitter and send a tweet to either me at Kamal AJE or the show's editor at Abid Oliver Ali, all one word. Or if you're not on Twitter, drop us an email. countingthecost@aljazeera.net is our address. And while you're online, head to aljazeera.net/English, hit the business tab at the top, and then link on to the CTC page to catch up with any of our past episodes in full whenever you want. But that is it for this edition of Counting the Cost. I'm Kamal Santamaria from the whole team. Thanks for joining us. The news on Al Jazeera is next.